Hello and welcome back. This is ProTaleDev back with another Tycoon farm, dungeon farm Tycoon game. And this time what we're going to be looking at is we're actually going to go back and look at placement. So what I've done in the last week since our last video is I've been working on the placement a little bit more because I really wanted it to get done. Basically, I did say I wanted to do the current set, I wanted to work on the gold system, but it won't be too much of a system, it won't be too advanced, so I decided to get the placement out of the way. Also, placement is very important in Tycoon games, so I really wanted to get the grid and everything working before I moved on. So, let's just show you what I've got. So if we just load it up here, as you can see, there's very immediately, instead of the big list that we had before, bear in mind the design will change quite a lot, I'm sure, throughout this process of developing this game, but I basically made a better menu, and that's kind of reminiscent of most Tycoon games. So basically you have all the buildings on one section which you can click, just like before, and you've got paths and you've got scenery. So if I were to click on the path, got that, and you've got the scenery. Now the big thing I want to mention here is that these are now all working. So if I were to click on this building, you can actually see I've clicked on this water well, because that will be one of the resources that people need. You got food, you can click on all of these now, they've all been set up correctly. So if we go to paths, you can actually click on individual paths now, and if we go to scenery, you can do the same. So all of these are now working. But the very big thing about this is that while this is very similar to how I did how I explained it in the previous episode, I've just included all these, just added some extra menus, and that will turn off and on so that we can just change between them. But moving on now to the really big thing, the really big important thing, and as you can see I've gotten rid of some stuff in here, I've redesigned it a little bit more, added some flowers and some grass on as extra. But that's not the big thing here. So right now I've got a house, and in the last episode I showed that I was able to click, I wasn't able to click these in the water, and I was able to put them anywhere on the island. Now if I try and click now, I don't know if you can hear that, but I'm clicking, you cannot place these anywhere. So what I've done is I've made it so that you can only place buildings next to paths, and I've made it so that you cannot place them on top of scenery. So to demonstrate this, we're going to go to paths, and we can also not place paths anywhere either. We actually have to connect them to the docks path. So this is a direct entrance to the island, but if I were to place them there, as you can see, we can actually place them. And this is going to be huge and very important for our pathfinding for our NPCs, but we can basically place these anywhere we want. We can place paths on top of each other, so you can change them and alter them in however you like. But as you can see, I'm just building out a little bit here, so that we can have a little bit of area to work with. Let's maybe put that, let's do this. So if we put this here, if I try and place a path now onto this scenery, it does work at the moment, so that's the one thing I never got round to changing. Sorry about that, guys, I had to do something. Let's try this again. I had to quickly go somewhere, so let's just quickly build this back up, so that we have more paths again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and place some scenery. Now the first thing you're going to mention about the scenery is you cannot place them directly next to paths or on paths. So scenery cannot be placed next to paths, they have to be one over. So you can place them around here if we just place a bunch, but you cannot place them next to paths, and I've coded that in. So let's also add in some more paths. We should be able to place buildings right next to these paths. So if we try and again we cannot place these anywhere but next to the paths, and you can place them on scenery. Initially what I'm going to do is, I wasn't too sure if you when you place them on top of scenery, if it should delete the scenery, or if you should have an option to manually delete it and it'll come up with a message saying you cannot place the building on there. Haven't decided yet, but that's something I'll decide later. I just wanted all the basic placement done. But if we try and go for, I don't know, a windmill, you can see we can place them, and if we place a farm, we can place it next to the path, but not further away. And you cannot, as you can see, it has to be next to a path. So this could mean that you could have some really interesting ideas in how your placement is set. So yeah, you can place it next to the path, but nothing else. And you cannot place a scenery onto a path. So the sceneries cannot go on paths and needs to be one away. Finally, paths cannot be placed on their own, they need to be placed next to another path. This will be important later for navigation with NPCs. So that's the placement shown. Obviously there's some problems still. Like, I think, not sure if you should be able to place buildings on scenery, maybe you have to delete them first, and that would imply that I need like a deletion button, kind of like in the old games which have bulldozers. Maybe I need something like that, instead of just replacing them like that, which probably would be better. The other thing is you cannot place paths or scenery in the environment either, not just buildings. So that's shown now. What I'm also gonna quickly show is the coding. So I'll quickly show the easy parts first. So the UI menus, this is just the UI that's actually changing between the different panels of the menu, and it's literally just setting something true and false, the game object true and false, and it's just as simple as that. I'm going to also use this script for option menus, so pause menus, and potentially other kind of menus if I have more. Probably will. Things like upgrade menus and stuff, we'll see. So the next thing I want to show is the random flip. So the random flip is something that's going to be added on some of these game objects, some of our prefabs. This will add a little bit of variation to our prefabs in terms of how they look. So maybe on the buildings and on the shops and things, we'll have like a random direction. All the flip is doing is just changing the X and Y. Just the X, and it'll set it to true or false. So if I were to go in here and click on our object, if we just set the X to true or false, it'll switch them the other way, and this will add a little bit of variation to the placement, I think. So I don't know if this should be an option that a player should be able to do, but for now it'll just be random, and I'll put that on the game objects later. So the next thing I want to look at is the destroy deconstruct. So what you can do is when you, the way this works is you hover over a game object, and as you can see we can click, so we can get rid of flowers, rocks, trees, and things like that. So the way this works is just like on our deletion script. On individual game objects, so let's go with our, this is specifically the scenery that has this. Probably going to have this on the buildings and things like that, but for now it's just on the scenery as a way of testing it. But on the scenery, we determine the number of the game object, which is already done through the placement, and when it matches, basically this will have this script, and based on its number and when we click in our placement script, so when we click delete in our placement script, and if we are actually hitting an object, and this is determined by our collision of our mouse. So when we have our selection, this little circle in the middle, our yellow selection point, the second that collides with an object, which is what it's doing now, it'll set to true. And what will actually happen is when you hover over it and when it sets true, then when you right click, which is getting the placement code from the script, from the placement script, detects that, and depending on what number the object is assigned to, it will do the action. So in that case, let's go with our bush, and in the bush it'll destroy the game object, it'll set it back to false, and it'll set the deletion press to false. So it'll have to be reactivated again. So it's very simple. We also will be getting gold back. I've put it in a comment here. So we'll be getting a little bit of gold, but not as much as what it's worth. So that's another thing to mention. This could be a strategy to use, deleting scenery at the beginning to get more gold, but it could also be bad because you get less gold from it, and scenery is going to add to your to your prestige of your level, your rating of your island. So that's the destroy. That's the deconstruction of so we can get rid of scenery. I'll probably do the same thing for buildings, but we'll see. Again, that was just for a test, and now we're on the main scripts. So we want to look at, before we do anything else, we're going to look at the closest object. Now, I've used this type of script in previous game jams and games before. All this is doing is checking what object is closest to it. So if we have this on our selection point, which we do, not our selection point, on our default object, our default snap. So this is the with every selection point, there's obviously the snap object, which is lining up with the grid, and that will always keep to an integer rather than a float. So it won't be a decimal point or anything. So it's much easier to calculate the closest with that, and so this will determine what the closest objects are, the closest path, and the closest building. And this is important for being able to place our paths close to each other and determining how close a scenery is to a building, because we want to make sure we know which is the closest one to that selection point when we're trying to click. So this script is finding the closest building and the closest path, so that we know where we know how far away we can place certain objects from individual objects. But now we're onto the main script. So there's a lot more code to this, a lot more prefabs and different objects that we're trying to take into account, and we've also got our array. So let's take this one bit at a time. This is our right mouse click, which is deleting. So it starts a little bit of a timer. So if we quickly go to here, after we click and it sets it to true, there's a little bit of a timer which actually disables it. So after a few seconds of it being activated, it will set back to false. This way it doesn't continuously try and delete. So if you're moving around your mouse, it doesn't start just deleting like crazy. It'll automatically turn off if you haven't clicked it already. So the next thing is that obviously we got our apart from our mouse clicks, now we have all of our game objects that we've taken into account. So just like previously an icon, we have all of different objects that are now icons and prefabs, so that we can place them. But we also have a couple of new things in here. So if I go down, that was our obviously this hasn't changed since last time. But what we got here is we've got a bunch more placement objects that are replacing our default building prefab. So like this well prefab and farms and things. So there's 7 of these objects, obviously probably going to be more in the future. And then we have the paths. They've all been set up the same way with their own individual code. I've given myself a bit of a break in between in between the numbers. So this one goes up to 7, this one goes to 20 to 27. Oh, sorry, to 30, and then this one goes from 40 to 48, so we've got 10 gap distance and so on. So this is very, very simple and similar to how we did it before, deciding the icon and the building based on a number. What we also have here is we have our selection of buildings, so this determines the number, and this is based on when we click the button. Again, just as before, when you click a specific button on the UI, it'll set off a function, and this function is in here, and this determines the number, and the number determines what building is selected. So very similar and very standard to what we've done already, but what we have here is what is really new, and this is the check valid tile, and this will determine if we are on land. And if we are on land, which we've already looked at previously, we weren't able to click on land. What we have in this script is now a little bit more advanced. So right now this is all the buildings for just general buildings and their numbers, and what we're doing is if we are on land and if a number it matches one of the buildings, so one of the buildings that we have, so if it's selected, then it's going to do this. So this is the distance to our closest path. So if we are close to our path from the snap point, then then we should be able to place it. So if we're close enough by 2, but if we're further enough away from, if we're not directly on it, but we are close enough, then we should be able to place it. And so that's what happens. It instantiates the building prefab. This makes it so that we cannot place the buildings on a path, but can place them next to it. So that's a simple code for the buildings. Next is the paths. Just a couple more numbers here. So again, same thing. If it's one of our paths, one of the numbers, the building number is set to a path number, then the distance between a snap point and the path is determined. So again, you can again, we're choosing here, we cannot place a path on a building, but we can place them on other paths, and we can place them one over, kind of similar to our last one. Finally, we have our last bit of code here, which again needs to be expanded a bit more because we need to be able to place we need to make it so that objects cannot be placed on scenery directly. Again, that needs to be added in, but I'll do that at another time. So again, the same thing. If it is one away, so again, remember we're going with integers, not floats for our distance. This is why we're going for a snap object, so it's easier to calculate this as just 1 over. And so if this is 1 over, then you should be able to place it, but it also needs to make sure that it's 1 over to be able to place the building and the path. So if it's 1 over from a building and it's 1 over from a path, then we should be able to place the scenery. So that's the basic code for that. Nothing too crazy, nothing too ridiculous, but it all works out pretty well. Again, this needs to be more needs to be added to this with more conditions about how to place them, and based on the numbers we could determine what path can be next to what. This will allow us to build out much more flushed out, so instead of being able to just put lines of paths everywhere that don't make sense, we could increase this this code here on our paths. Based on the number, we would be able to place a certain amount, and that would be before this this nested if statement. So that has been ProTaleDev, and next time what we're going to be looking at is most definitely the gold aspect, and potentially more specifically the way an NPC walks on these paths. So we want to be able to make it so that NPCs will just follow a path. So this has been ProTaleDev, and I'll see you next time.